Hello, in today's episode, we're happy to introduce Ricardo. Ricardo's research has covered resilience in healthcare workers, collaborative behaviour of energy companies, and public engagement in psychology and psychiatry. Ricardo recently established a master's level teaching module at King's on decolonising assessment, which empowers students to question and disrupt power structures that reinforce inequality and racism, which he discussed in an earlier episode on our podcast. Hello, it's lovely to have you here. And I guess we're going to start with a question just to get to know you better. How did you start kind of working at the intersection of climate change and mental health? And what do you feel like were the barriers that you faced in your career and like some of the skills that helped you really progress in the areas you wanted?
Okay, so I started working in behaviour of companies. So I had a grant from the Net Zero Technology Centre. And as an organisational psychologist, I'm really interested in behaviour change, how organisations work, group psychology. And I went through that path of trying to understand why it is that a lot of energy companies don't want to collaborate with each other and why there aren't really efficient standards within energy companies. They are extremely inefficient and really don't care about their impact on the environment unless it is for an economic outcome. And through that and my other interests within mental health and also my personal interests within environmentalism and veganism, I've started to think about these kind of issues and their links to the colonial history and decolonisation. So that's kind of my path of how I've been interested in this area and why I'm sat with you talking about this.
What do you feel like kind of helped you during your career? Was there ever like a moment where things became clear and you kind of knew what you wanted to do and why you were doing it?
Yeah, I definitely had that epiphany moment. I guess when I was in college, I actually went to see a film called Hotel Rwanda. And I remember being sat in that film, me and my brother went to go and watch that and just being so shocked at not only what I was seeing in terms of the Rwandan genocide, but the fact that when I was younger, I hadn't really engaged with the fact that this was happening. And from watching that film, I just deeply knew that I wanted to understand what the processes behind genocide and people committing such atrocities were. So that was the point in my life that I knew, okay, I'm going to become a psychologist. I'm going to really understand these things. And actually, it didn't take too long to realize that the field of psychology quite deeply understands why this happens. But what we're not able to do is to change this really common human behavior. Yeah, so discrimination research, inequality, understanding discrimination was the core of what made me kind of become a psychologist. And then in terms of how I've been able to get into this position, I guess I've got to recognize a lot of my privilege. I don't really look like most psychologists, but I have a grandfather who was a quite eminent sociologist, and then my grandfather on the other side was at one point the Minister of Education in Ghana. So I've definitely come from a family of educators and of academics, and I've had that privilege, and I think now I'm trying to leave the door open and encourage more diverse people to become academics.
Yeah, that I think is so important, especially like in the sustainable sector and stuff. There just isn't enough diversity, really.
It's quite white, isn't it?
It very much is, and like, obviously I'm a white person that's like trying to recognize that and also trying to see how you do these things and how you can be more inclusive. And it is a hard journey, and we've got such ingrained things in our society that we really need to change. I guess my next question really is kind of what does mental health related to climate change mean to you, and like how do you kind of think about these ideas of well-being and maybe what they're connected to?
Yeah, when we think about well-being as psychologists, we're thinking about the total experience of mental health, not just the removal of mental ill health. So people's ability to positively impact their community and to feel good in all walks of their life. How does that impact climate? Well, we have this catastrophe that is ongoing, and there are lots of different negative impacts this has, from things related to disasters that are happening, and things like obviously wildfires and increase in temperature, typhoons, things like this, people being not able to live in their previous environments. And all of these things have a certain amount of strain. They cause stresses, which increases the amount of mental ill health that people from all of these communities all around the world experience.
That's really interesting. And I guess, obviously you do a lot of work on decolonisation, and it's such an important part of sustainability to see that colonialism has had such an effect on how we live. And even the fact that, we see this disparity of, the Western countries, America, producing so many emissions, and then the brunt of the impacts are being taken on by people that are actually very vulnerable and in positions which are more disadvantaged than us. So I guess, how do you view decolonisation in the context of kind of mental health and climate change, and what kind of scale of analysis do you feel like it's the individual, the country, or kind of an international thing that needs to happen to change these like power structures?
It's a really great question. So to start off with, let's think about decolonisation. How do we define decolonisation? Personally, I would say it's about understanding the historic legacy of inequality and changing that. And currently, in a lot of the climate conversations, there's a lot of neo-colonialism, new versions of colonialism. The one argument that new developing nations might have against meeting targets for reducing our impact on the climate are the fact that developed nations have had freedom to pollute and to have their industrial revolutions without being checked by any other nations. And I think we can respond to this. We can understand that there is an inherent neo-colonial element within the climate discussion, and recognize that there's a lot more that developed nations need to do to give the same opportunity to developing nations, but for them to avoid making the mistakes that developed nations have made. I think decolonisation is a large part of making some positive change when it comes to the climate, to really understand what the power dynamics are of the different, not only countries, but also companies that are having a lot of negative impacts on the planet.
Do you think working, like the kind of work that you do, helps you maybe deal with, eco-grief or anxiety surrounded to these things? Because obviously they're very sensitive topics and they always hit close to home, at least for me. And like, has that helped you? Has it made you feel more empowered? Like, I can take action and things are changing. Has it been like a positive experience?
Yeah, so I think whenever you're in a position where, as an educator, I'm able to think about these problems and to educate other people on these problems and to really offer power to other people to try and enact change, I think that's a really empowering process. It's also interesting you mentioned these ideas of eco-anxiety and eco-grief. I think it's important to consider that these are really new terms that have a lot of really important meaning to a lot of people. A lot of people are feeling this sense of anguish and grief in relation to climate change. And while this is separate from a formal diagnosis of anxiety, this is a new term that we're kind of using as psychologists to recognise the negative impacts on people's mental health that climate change is causing.
Yeah, no, definitely. I guess my next question would be, obviously we kind of know that global politics isn't doing enough to help kind of climate vulnerable communities, which climate vulnerable in the sense that they become vulnerable to a lot of different things. And even in the UK, there's such like unequal levels of air pollution, for example. Depending where you live, you might be a lot more exposed to this. And I guess something I'd like to know is how kind of the research and the work you're doing, how do you think we can transform that into action? And how do you think, for example, students at King's can find healthier ways to cope with climate change, to cope with these things, and then actually create long-term solutions?
So I think firstly we can empower people. I think there's two paths. We can empower people to realise that individuals really can enact change. You were talking about an example just before we started recording of a King's student who actually got King's to divest. Yeah. What was the name of it?
Roger Hallam from XR.
So he had a hunger strike, right?
Yeah. He basically did a hunger strike at King's to convince him to divest from fossil fuels, because he was writing his PhD on civil disobedience and kind of came to the conclusion that, we have to be disobedient in order to get these changes that he clearly wanted. Yeah.
So that example of individuals, the Rosa Parkses, who are able to enact change from an individual action can be really empowering for people. And I think the other part of my answer would be to use stories. I think people change and people are empowered by really compelling stories. And I think when it comes to climate change, I'm not sure if there have been enough compelling stories for the tipping point of the population to decide, right, we need drastic change in our behavior. And it's really sad because while I say that, I recognize that there are these clear crises that have happened that can be directly linked to climate change. But it hasn't yet got to a point, perhaps, or maybe, I don't know what your opinion is on this, where it's compelling enough that there's a story that everyone can get behind. In the same way that I'm seeing some advertising around our heat waves that we've had across Europe, especially in the UK, where we had a couple of 40-degree days this previous summer, which is totally abnormal. And those are the start of stories where, if we can get people to accept that this is because of climate change, and this isn't just the normal change that tends to happen over time, then we can empower people to actually make some drastic change.
Yeah, no, it definitely feels like taking that approach of like empathetic, like you need to be able to empathize and sympathize with this problem to then take action. And I definitely agree. I think one of our biggest problems is that these kind of frontline communities that are facing climate change the most aren't being listened to. And you see it at COP this year, for example, there are people already saying, please listen to us. You know, we're here, we're experiencing it. And it's, for example, Indigenous knowledge. There's so many people that live in this balance with nature that we just don't seem to get. And I think it's so hard to maybe see those solutions and feel empowered when you are in a very capitalist society. When we live in London, which is really a big centre of capitalism across the planet. So I don't know if you agree with me, but I think we really need to bring those voices to the table, and they need to be part of the conversations all the time. Because if it's just about us and our opinions, and as you were saying, like companies think about profit, if we're constantly thinking about that, we're never going to get to solutions that help.
That's actually really, it's such a fascinating thing that you've mentioned there. I agree, companies focus on profit. I think when it comes to the behavior of companies, there are really three factors that decide whether a company is going to change its behavior: the economic outlook, the legal framework in which the company can operate, and then ethics. And only now are we slowly starting to see, and honestly, I think a lot of the focus on ethics is probably more due to meeting ESG goals for economic reasons rather than for actual ethical reasons. But it's only when companies start to say, okay, we actually need to act in a way that's ethical and for the longevity of the planet. Some of these problems are inherent within capitalism. If we think about what a company is, it's a group of people that have come together to invest in something to make money. And if the end goal is creating money, and within the financial system, you don't actually pay the full cost of a behavior, then it's very likely that companies are going to have behaviors that have a negative impact on the planet. What I kind of mean by don't pay the full cost, for instance, if you have a coal power plant, it creates power for whatever cost per kilowatt hour, but that cost doesn't take into account the impact of the environment that coal power plant will have versus solar or even a nuclear power plant. And if we're just looking at the bottom line of how much money something makes, we're able to take away from the future, from people who will actually have to pay the cost of what that carbon output was, or what the negative impact was. So there are some mechanisms where we've tried to include like carbon credits and some amount of carbon, but core within our financial system, within our medium of exchange, we don't really have the full cost of behaviours.
And I guess it's really interesting to me that you kind of look at this behavioural changes. I mean, how do you think we can kind of progress into a society that does change our behavior more, because I think that's something I've been noticing is we are changing our behavior, but it's a very, very slow process, and it almost feels like you have to start from that bottom education when you're a kid till you die. So like what do you feel like we could do to change our behavior as consumers, for example?
Well, first, when it comes to behavior change, I can tell you firstly, behavior change tends to happen quite slowly for the whole population, and also tends to happen in jumps. Individuals have these epiphanies where they'll move from one stage of behavior change to another when they realize, I need to stop smoking, or I need to stop polluting or commuting in this really wasteful way. And for more and more of society to decide to have those big steps of change, we need to have a tipping point, basically, of people who are influential, who others look to, who will refuse to continue these negative behaviors. It's really easy nowadays for a person to say, look, I'm not going to change the flights that I go on or the way that I commute because that's what everyone around me does. We tend to copy not only influential people, but all of the people close to us. So changing norms, also recognizing this stuff happens really slowly, and also recognizing the other negatives of behavior change, what doesn't work well. And sadly, what doesn't seem to work well is getting people to think about far in the future. It's really hard for people to think about their own futures. We've struggled a lot with getting people to save for retirement and to plan for when they won't be as healthy as they are currently. But when it comes to thinking about projects that are for 2, 3, 4 generations in the future, or even thousands of years, that's what humanity is absolutely awful at. There are so few examples of when we've been able to get political will to do things for the far future. Generally, projects need to be 3 years, and sometimes we'll be able to do things that are by the end of the decade. A lot of this is linked to the way that our political systems work, with limited terms, but generally people aren't really able to think forward to the future, and we tend to think over positively of the future. We tend to think, oh, things will be all right, or we'll have nuclear fusion by that time and it'll all be okay. We can carry on using this amount of energy, or we're definitely overly positive.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree with that, and it's interesting, like, to realize that behavior change is slow, and to think, okay, so like going off that information, let's have these long-term plans. Let's put things in place that are going to, and I think that's something that at COP a lot of people are asking it for, is long-term plans that actually include resilience and adaptation, so people become stronger people and they are more able to have these behavior changes. And I think that's super linked to our mental health, in the sense that, you know, aside from the catastrophe that is climate change, also knowing that we're kind of all going along with this behavior and not changing probably does, I don't know what you think, but I think that also has an effect on these feelings of like anxiety, because if you can't do anything and you kind of see everyone else not doing anything, it can be very defeating.
Apathy, when a person considers how little the impact that they could possibly have on the environment is, I think that can be really debilitating. But I think we really need to inspire those people to realize, firstly, there are the examples of the Greta Thunbergs of the world who are able to radically change people's view on the environment. And then just anyone who is, if someone can half or reduce their amount of energy use, and if everyone else was able to do that, there's the recognition that encouraging someone to act in a way in which, if everyone acted, the problem would be reduced, it's really empowering. We could sit here today, and if in one moment we could tell everyone, right, we all have to just stop, and we all have a limit of the amount of energy that we could use, we could transform our impact on the planet. But yeah, encouraging people to realize that every individual deeply matters, that's challenging. But a lot of that is because we tend to go towards the path of least resistance, or to keep things the same, because that is easier and it saves effort. But yeah, we need change, really.
Yeah, no, it's really hard, that individual collective and how it works. And even just today, I was reading one of the oil CEOs at COP was saying how it's our responsibility. She was completely blaming consumers and saying, you're the one using the fuel, you're the one driving your car, you're the one wearing your clothes, so you're responsible. Yeah. And I'm just thinking, wow, I get where you're coming from in the sense that we all need to change, but it's very hard to be the individual small speck in the big world. And you want these companies to be encouraging you and not blaming you for not recycling or not doing this, when in fact, okay, you can recycle in London, but if the council don't have enough recycling bins and the recycling isn't actually being sorted out, then you're telling me to do something, but in fact, you don't even have a good recycling infrastructure. So it feels a bit, like you're being blamed for something that isn't your fault. And I think that also kind of plays into us sort of that apathetic.
But there it's all about responsibility and who should have responsibility for climate change. And I think the problem is once you've started the conversation about responsibility, you're already into negative territory, because in an ideal world, everyone has shared responsibility. No one would be able to say, oh, it should be this group's responsibility or that group's responsibility. Every individual within an energy company would say, yes, of course, the consumer has responsibility, but they're also consumers and they are also producers as well. There is no individual on the planet that doesn't have a responsibility to change behaviour, to encourage just a better planet for the future.
Yeah. Do you have, I guess, any last advice for students, just generally with behaviour change and feelings of a negative mental health and trying to overcome these behaviour changes and trying to implement them?
I think a recognition that you can 180, you can absolutely transform your behaviours in this moment. A person can, in a second, decide, you know what, I'm going to try meat-free Mondays or not eat meat at all, or I'm going to commute via walking or bike instead of taking a more polluting form of transport. In any second, you can change your behaviour. So be empowered and realise that the individual really does matter. And when it comes to responsibility, it can be easy to look at the big Shells and BPs and say, oh, those are the companies doing the polluting. But realise that eventually all of your cohort as students, you're going to be part of those companies. You're going to be hopefully CEOs of the new versions of those companies that are more renewable. So recognise that you're a part of those companies and you all exist within this system of supply and demand, and each individual really does matter.
Totally agree. I think, we're in the system, but we are the system. Like, we are what makes it work, and we can change these things. And I think that's a great note to end on, really.
Thank you very much.
So thank you for listening to this episode. We hope you've all enjoyed, and please subscribe to our newsletter and give this podcast a rating and let us know what you want to hear about next. It was so nice to have you.